The first time I heard true silence in that room, I felt every hair on my arms rise. Not because it was empty, because it was full, and nobody was making a sound. I was sitting at the long curved table on Station Halveth, 3 seats down from Ambassador Grace Holloway, when the Krill delegation began their opening address. Their leader, a tall creature with plaited skin and a voice that rattled the water in my cup, roared out his fleet numbers like a proud father listing his children. 6,000 warships, 12 moons under direct control, a history of victories read aloud like a song. The Sonari representative across from him answered just as loudly, listing her own numbers, her own conquests, slamming a clawed hand on the table for emphasis. This was normal. This was how first contact summits worked. Every species spoke like it was afraid that silence would be mistaken for surrender. Then it was our turn. Grace stood, folded her hands, and said, "Humanity thanks the Assembly for this opportunity to speak." That was it. No numbers, no boasting, no song of victories. She sat back down. The room did not know what to do with that. I watched the Creel leader's plates shift, the way they do when he was confused, and I watched the Sonari representative tilt her head, waiting for more. There was no more. Grace had said what she came to say, and now she was simply watching them, calm, unreadable, her hands folded on the table like she was waiting for tea to be served. "That is all?" the Krill leader asked. "You have no fleet count? No claim to defend?" "We have both," Grace said. "We simply do not see the need to announce them before we understand what this assembly actually wants from us." A ripple of sound went through the chamber, translators clicking, low voices murmuring in 6 different tongues. I sat very still, watching the reactions, because this was my job. I was not a diplomat. I was a communications specialist, technically an aide, but really I was there to read the room and report back to command what these species actually felt, underneath their translated words. And what I read that day was simple. They thought we were weak. They thought our silence meant we had nothing to say because we had nothing to be proud of. The Vex ambassador, a small quick creature with too many eyes, laughed, an odd clicking sound that the translator rendered as amusement. "The quiet ones," he said, looking around at his colleagues. "I have heard of this from the traders. The humans do not speak much. Perhaps they do not have much to speak of." A few of the others laughed too. Not cruel laughter, not yet. The kind of laughter you give to a joke you think is harmless. I felt my jaw tighten, but Grace did not move. She did not flinch, did not straighten in defense, did not even blink. She simply waited until the laughter died down on its own, the way you wait out a rain shower you know will pass. "You may believe what you like," she said finally. "We are here to listen, not to convince." I remember thinking, even then, young as I was in that seat, that this silence was not what it looked like. I had grown up around people who went quiet before something serious happened. My grandmother used to go silent for entire days before she made a hard decision, and everyone in the family knew to leave her alone, because whatever she was carrying it without asking anyone to carry it for her. I recognized that same quiet in Grace. It was not absence, it was containment. The Creel leader did not recognize it though, and neither did anyone else in that chamber. To them, a species that spoke less had less to offer. Their entire culture was built on broadcast, on display, on making sure every neighboring system knew exactly how strong you were before you ever had to prove it. Silence to them was a hole where strength should be. It never occurred to them that a species might choose silence the way you choose to keep a blade sheathed. Not because it is dull, because you have not decided yet whether you need to draw it. The summit continued for 3 more hours. I will not walk through every exchange, because most of it was posturing, empire after empire taking turns to remind the room of their power. The Denari talked about their orbital forges. The Sonari spoke of their border wars, each one a badge they wore proudly. The Vex bragged about their trade routes stretching across 4 sectors, and every time it came back to us, Grace gave short, careful answers, never more than she needed to give, never puffed up, never small either, just plain, just true, just enough. By the end of the session, I noticed something that stuck with me for years afterward. The other delegates had started watching us more than they watched each other, not with respect, with a kind of puzzled suspicion, the way you look at a locked door in a house you thought you knew completely. They could not read us the way they read each other, because we were not playing the same game, and species that cannot read each other tend to fill the silence with their own fears. After the session ended, I was gathering datapads when the Vex ambassador approached our table. His name was something long and clicking that translated roughly to Ezreal Tanik Vash, but everyone just called him Ezreal for short, because even the translators got tired halfway through. "Your ambassador does not talk much," he said to me directly, his many eyes blinking in a staggered pattern that I later learned meant curiosity. "She talks when there is something worth saying," I answered. Ezreal's mouthparts moved in what I think was meant to be a smile. A strange way to run an empire. We are taught that silence before a fight means you have already lost the argument in your own mind. I did not answer right away. I was thinking about my grandmother again, about my training instructor back on Earth who used to tell us that panic was loud and discipline was quiet, and that the two should never be confused for one another. But Ezreal did not know any of that. To him, and to every species in that chamber, our silence was simply strange behavior from a young, unproven species that had barely left its own solar system before joining a galaxy full of empires that had been fighting and trading and conquering for thousands of years. "You will learn," I said, and I meant it kindly, not as a threat. I truly believed, even then, that understanding would come with time, the way it comes between neighbors who slowly learn each other's habits. Ezreal laughed his clicking laugh again and walked away, already turning to speak with the Denari delegation, already forgetting about us the way you forget about a quiet guest at a loud party. I stayed a moment longer at the table, watching Grace pack away her notes with slow, careful movements. She had barely spoken 20 sentences the entire session, yet she looked more tired than anyone else in the room, the kind of tired that comes from choosing every word before you let it leave your mouth. "They think we are weak," I said to her quietly, once the chamber had mostly emptied. "I know," she said, not looking up from her notes. "Does that worry you?" She finally looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that I would only understand much later, once I had seen more of what our silence actually meant when it mattered. It was not worry, it was patience, the kind that comes from knowing something the room does not know yet, and choosing not to explain it before it is needed. "Let them think what they like," she said. "We are not here to be understood, we are here to be ready." I did not fully understand what she meant that day. I was too young in this work, too new to the strange choreography of a galaxy full of loud, proud empires who mistook noise for strength. It would take a crisis, a real one, before I understood the shape of what I had been sitting next to that whole session. But I remember walking back to our shuttle that evening, past groups of Krill officers still boasting about their fleet numbers to anyone who would listen, past Sonari traders arguing loudly over territory rights, past the general hum of a galaxy that never seemed to stop talking about itself. And I remember thinking that there was something almost lonely about being the only quiet voice in a room full of shouting. I did not yet know that this loneliness was actually a kind of armor. I did not know that somewhere far from that chamber, our fleets were already learning to move the same way Grace spoke, saying only what needed to be said, showing only what needed to be shown, keeping the rest folded away like a blade in its sheath. I did not know that the silence we carried into that room was not a lack of confidence. It was the beginning of something the rest of the galaxy had never seen before, and would not understand until it was standing right in front of them, close enough to feel. That night, back in my quarters aboard the station, I opened a private channel to home and sent a short report, the kind Grace had trained me to write. No embellishment, no drama, just facts. Summit concluded. Other delegates dismissive of human communication style. Recommend no change in approach. I sent it, and then I sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the low hum of the station around me, thinking about how strange it was that the loudest room I had ever sat in had been won, in its own quiet way, by the people who said the least. I did not know yet how right that feeling would turn out to be. I only knew that something about that silence had settled into my chest and stayed there, patient, waiting, the way it always seemed to wait, right up until the moment it was needed most. The habit did not begin with Grace, and it did not begin with me. It began long before either of us was born, back when humanity was still learning how to survive its own mistakes. I learned most of this from a man named Nathan Ford, who trained new attachés like me in a small classroom on a supply station orbiting a moon most people had never heard of. He was not a soft teacher. He believed that understanding where a habit came from was the only way to trust it when it mattered. "You want to know why we go quiet?" he said to a room of 12 of us, all still stiff in our new uniforms. "Then you need to understand that humans learned a long time ago that panic spreads faster than any signal we could send." He told us about the early centuries, long before any of us had been born, when disasters used to spread through crowded cities, not because the danger itself was so great, but because the fear of it multiplied every time someone shouted the news down a street. A single cry of alarm could turn a manageable situation into a disaster within minutes, simply because fear does not need facts to travel. It only needs a voice. "So we learned to lower our voices when things got serious," Nathan said, "not because we felt less, because feeling loudly in a crisis gets people hurt." He showed us old records, grainy and worn, of emergency responders who spoke in flat, careful tones even while walking into the worst moments of their lives, because a calm voice kept the people around them calm too. He showed us reports from small, forgotten conflicts where the units that stayed quietest under pressure were almost always the ones who came home whole, because silence meant the opposing side could not hear you coming, and discipline meant your own side did not fall apart from fear. "It is not natural," he admitted, when one of my classmates, a sharp young man named Ethan Marsh, asked why other species did not do the same. "Most living things are loud when they are afraid. Loud is the default. Quiet is a skill. We built that skill over centuries, generation after generation, because we learned the hard way what loud panic costs you." I remember Ethan asking him directly, "So when we go silent, it is not because we feel nothing?" Nathan looked at him for a long moment before answering. "It is because we feel everything, and we have decided the room does not need to carry that weight with us. We carry it ourselves, quietly, until the moment we can put it down safely." That lesson stayed with me long after I left that classroom, long after Nathan stepped back from teaching and returned to fleet work, long after I had forgotten most of the technical details from those early training days. It stayed with me because it explained something I had always felt but never had words for, growing up watching my own family go quiet before hard days, watching people on old recordings speak in level voices even while the world around them fell apart. Other species did not have this. I learned this properly a few months after the summit on Station Halveth, when a Sonari scholar named Illyra Voss requested a meeting with our delegation to study what she called the human silence problem. She was not hostile, she was simply curious, the way academics are curious about anything they cannot explain through their own culture's assumptions. "Every species I have studied broadcasts distress," she told me, sitting across from me in a small meeting room aboard our transport ship. "It is efficient. If your neighbor is in danger and they cry out, you know immediately to help or to flee. Broadcasting fear keeps a species alive. It is one of the oldest tools any of us have." "And you think we lack that tool?" I said. "I think you have hidden it somewhere I cannot find," she said, and there was no insult in her voice, only genuine puzzlement, the kind a scientist feels when a pattern refuses to behave the way every other pattern has behaved before. "I have reviewed recordings from 3 separate incidents involving human colonies under strain. In each case, the humans involved reduced their communication output as the danger increased, rather than increasing it, as every other recorded species does. This should not keep a population alive. And yet in every case, your people survived at a higher rate than similar incidents involving other empires." I did not have a full answer for her that day. I only had Nathan's lesson and my grandmother's quiet days, and the calm, folded stillness I had watched Grace carry into a room full of shouting delegates. I told Illyra as much of it as I understood, and she listened carefully, taking notes in a script I could not read, occasionally asking a question that made me realize how strange our habits must look from the outside. So distress, for your people, is something to be managed privately, she said eventually, almost to herself. Not something to be shared. Not eliminated, I corrected her gently, just controlled. There is a difference between feeling nothing and choosing not to broadcast what you feel. She sat with that for a long moment, and I could see her trying to fit it into whatever framework her own species used to understand behavior. Sonari culture, like most of the cultures represented at that summit, ran on open display of emotion. If you were afraid, your body language showed it plainly, your voice carried it, your allies rallied around you, because they could read your fear as easily as they read the weather. A species that hid its fear, that trained itself for generations to fold distress into something quiet and controlled, was not just unusual to her, it was almost unsettling, the way a locked box is unsettling when you cannot see what is inside it, and cannot guess by shaking it either. I would like to continue this research, she said finally, if your people would allow it. I told her I would pass the request along, and I did, though I never found out what became of her study, not directly. What I did find out months later was that Illyra's early notes on human silence had been shared quietly among certain scholarly circles across 2 or 3 empires, and that a small, cautious unease had begun to grow in places I would never have expected it to reach. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Just the beginning of a question that nobody quite knew how to ask out loud. What happens when the quiet ones stop being quiet by accident, and start being quiet on purpose, for a reason nobody outside their own species can predict? I thought about that question a lot in the months that followed, mostly late at night, mostly when the station around me had gone dark and still, and I had nothing to do but turn old conversations over in my mind. I thought about the drills we ran back home, the ones Nathan used to oversee personally, where entire units practiced staying silent under simulated pressure, not because silence itself won anything, but because silence bought time. Time to think, time to plan, time to let the people who needed to act, without 100 worried voices crowding the channel and turning a solvable problem into chaos. I remembered a specific exercise, one of the last ones Nathan ran before he stepped back from teaching. He split our class into 2 groups and told half of us to respond to a simulated colony emergency the way most species in the galaxy responded, with open channels, shared alarm, constant updates flooding every available frequency. The other half, my half, was told to respond the old way, the quiet way, coordinating through short, precise bursts of information and otherwise staying silent, trusting each other to follow the plan without needing constant reassurance. My group finished the exercise 11 minutes faster than the other group, with fewer resources lost and no confusion in the final response. It was not because we were smarter or braver, it was because we were not spending half our effort managing each other's worry. We were spending all of it solving the actual problem in front of us. This is why we go quiet, Nathan told us afterward, standing at the front of that same small classroom, looking at each of us in turn. Not because we are cold, because noise costs something every single time you use it, and the moment truly matters. You want to spend everything you have on solving the problem, not on comforting each other through it. I did not fully understand, back then, how far that habit would carry us, or how strange it would look to a galaxy that had never trained itself the same way. I understood the small version of it, the version that helped a training exercise finish 11 minutes faster. I did not yet understand the large version, the one that would eventually make an entire hostile empire question whether attacking us had been a mistake, simply because we stopped talking at the exact moment they expected us to start speaking loudly. That understanding came later, and it came fast, and it came in a place I had never expected to see it happen. But the seeds of it, the real roots of why humanity carried its silence the way we did, had already been planted long before I ever sat in that quiet chamber on Station Halveth, long before Illyra Voss ever asked her careful questions, long before any of us knew just how loudly our silence would eventually speak. The message came in at 4 in the morning, station time, and it was only 4 words long. Meridian Colony. Contact. Silent now. I was awake within seconds, pulling on my uniform in the dark, already moving toward the command deck before I had finished reading the rest of the alert. Meridian was a joint colony, shared between our people and a small trading partner species called the Doran, sitting on the edge of a contested border that 3 empires had quietly been eyeing for years. It was not a military outpost. It was farms and schools and a modest shipyard, the kind of place nobody expected to be the center of anything important. The Korath Dominion had other plans. By the time I reached the command deck, Grace was already there, along with a colony commander named Owen Pierce, who had been running Meridian's defense coordination for the past 2 years and had never once needed to declare a real emergency. His voice on the comm feed was steady, but I could hear the tightness underneath it, the sound of a man doing everything he could to keep his words level. 3 Korath cruisers dropped out of transit 20 minutes ago, Owen reported. They are broadcasting standard conquest terms on an open channel. Surrender the colony or face bombardment within the hour. This was, I would later learn, exactly how the Korath had taken 4 other border colonies in the past decade. Their strategy relied on noise, loud threats, loud ultimatums, loud displays of firepower meant to trigger panic before a single weapon was ever used. Panic made defenders sloppy. Panic made commanders make mistakes. Panic, more often than not, won wars before they properly started. Options, Grace said, calm as ever, though I noticed her hands were folded tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. We evacuate what we can and hold the line with what we have, Owen said. It will not be enough. Their weapons outmatch our defenses by a wide margin. There was a pause on the line, and then Owen said something that I did not fully understand at the time, though I would come to understand it completely before the day was over. Requesting authorization to go dark, he said. Grace did not hesitate. Authorized. I turned to her, confused, because everything in me, every instinct built from years of watching emergency broadcasts and crisis drills, expected the opposite response. Surely, when an enemy fleet arrives and threatens bombardment, the correct move is to broadcast for help, to call in every ally within range, to make noise until someone answers. What does that mean? I asked her quietly. Going dark. It means Owen is about to do exactly what he was trained to do, Grace said, without looking away from the display. And it means the Korath are about to learn something they were never taught to expect. Within minutes, Meridian's communication signature dropped to almost nothing. No distress calls, no panicked evacuation broadcasts, no visible chatter between defense stations. To any outside observer watching the colony's signal output, it would have looked exactly like a population that had already given up, already surrendered to whatever was coming, too frightened to even ask for help. That was, I realized, precisely the point. I watched the tactical display with a knot in my stomach, unable to see what was actually happening on the ground, because Owen's people were not sending updates. They were not narrating their own crisis for an audience. They were simply doing the work, quietly, exactly the way Nathan had trained an entire generation of us to do, exactly the way Grace had sat silently through an entire summit while the galaxy mocked her for it. The Korath commander, whose voice we could still hear on the open channel because he had never stopped broadcasting, grew visibly frustrated by the lack of response. Meridian Colony, respond, he demanded, his translated voice sharp with irritation. Your silence changes nothing. Surrender your colony or face immediate consequence. Nothing answered him, not a single voice, not a single flicker of panic, not the pleading tone he was clearly expecting to hear from a population staring down 3 warships. I imagine, though I will never know for certain, that this silence unsettled him more than any counter-threat could have. A species that begs, you understand, a species that goes completely still, offering no information at all, is a mystery you cannot plan around. They are moving into attack position, Owen's voice finally returned, clipped and precise, 40 minutes after his initial report. We are executing the response. That was all he said. No description of what the response actually involved. No countdown, no dramatic narration, nothing to fill the silence except the simple fact that a plan was already in motion, and the people carrying it out did not feel the need to explain themselves while they worked. I found out later, piecing it together from Owen's official report once the crisis had passed, that Meridian's defense teams had spent the previous 20 minutes in near total silence, coordinating through short pre-arranged signal bursts, each one lasting less than a second, carrying only the minimum information needed to keep everyone aligned. No one spoke over open comms. No one asked questions that could be answered by following the plan they had already rehearsed 100 times. They moved shielding into position. They redirected power away from anything the Korath sensors could easily detect. They repositioned civilian shelters using routes that had been mapped and remapped during quiet drills that had never before been tested against a real threat. From the outside, none of this was visible. From the outside, Meridian looked like a colony that had simply stopped existing, its signals gone dark, its people either fled or already lost. The Korath commander, expecting either a desperate plea or a doomed last stand, found neither, and I think that absence of expected noise cost him more than he ever realized. "They are hesitating," Owen reported, 45 minutes in. "Their formation has slowed." Grace allowed herself the smallest exhale, not quite relief, more like the release of a breath she had been holding without noticing. "Good," she said. "Let them hesitate." I asked her, in that stretch of tense waiting, why the Korath commander would slow down simply because Meridian had gone quiet. Surely a silent target was an easier target, not a harder one. "Because he does not know what the silence means," she said. "He has fought colonies that scream. He has fought colonies that beg. He knows exactly how to handle both, because both tell him something about his enemy's state of mind. Meridian is telling him nothing, and an enemy who tells you nothing is an enemy you cannot predict, which means every choice he makes now, he makes blind." I understood, in that moment, something I had only partly grasped since the summit on Station Halveth. Our silence had never been about hiding weakness. It had been about denying information, about refusing to hand an opponent the one thing every attacker relies on most, which is a clear read on how frightened, how prepared, or how desperate the other side actually is. The Korath fleet held its position for nearly 20 more minutes, sensors sweeping Meridian's surface, searching for any signal, any flicker of activity that might tell them what they were truly facing. They found almost nothing because Owen's people had trained for exactly this, hiding their movements behind the same discipline that had made my old training exercise finish 11 minutes faster than the loud version ever could. Then, finally, the Korath commander made his decision, and it was the wrong one. "They are advancing," Owen reported, his voice still perfectly level, "initiating full response." What happened next, I did not witness directly, and out of respect for the accuracy of this account, I will not pretend to describe details I only received secondhand through official reports, written well after the fact. What I can say is that within 11 minutes of the Korath fleet crossing into range, all 3 cruisers had been disabled and forced into retreat, their weapons neutralized before they were ever able to fire on the colony below. Meridian's population, every farmer, every teacher, every shipyard worker, remained entirely safe throughout the entire encounter, moved quietly into shelters they had rehearsed reaching 100 times before, never once needing to broadcast a single word of fear to the rest of the galaxy. When Owen's voice finally returned to the open channel, hours after his last update, it was as calm and level as it had been at 4 in the morning when this had all begun. "Meridian colony secure," he said. "Threat neutralized. No colonial losses." That was all. No triumph in his voice, no relief, no drawn-out account of what his people had endured in those long, silent hours. Just the facts, delivered the way Grace had delivered her opening statement at the summit, plain and true, and exactly enough. I sat back in my chair on the command deck, and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding for the better part of an hour. Around me, the deck remained quiet, the way it always did, even in victory. Nobody cheered, nobody raised their voice. We had learned, generations ago, that the moment for noise comes after the danger has passed, and even then, only in careful measure. It was only later, once the reports of Meridian's defense began circulating among the other empires, that I understood just how much that quiet victory had unsettled the galaxy watching from a distance. The Korath had expected a colony that begged, or a colony that fell. Instead, they found a colony that said nothing at all, right up until the moment their entire attacking force was disabled and sent limping back across the border, and I would soon learn that this silence, more than any single weapon we had ever built, was the thing that would finally make the rest of the galaxy start paying very close attention to us. News travels strangely across a galaxy full of empires that do not trust each other. It does not move in straight lines, it moves in whispers, in trade rumors, in the careful reports that intelligence officers write for audiences who will read between every line for weakness. Within 3 weeks of the Meridian encounter, I was assigned to help compile a full account of what had happened, not for our own records, which were already thorough, but for the analysts back home who wanted to understand exactly how the rest of the galaxy was reacting to what we had done. That task fell largely to a sharp, quiet woman named Claire Whitfield, who worked several decks below the command level, surrounded by data feeds pulled from trade routes, diplomatic channels, and the occasional intercepted broadcast that other empires had not realized was being monitored. I spent 2 days sitting across from her small desk, watching her piece together a picture that was far larger than anything I had expected. "The Korath are furious," she told me, pulling up a series of translated reports. "Not because they lost 3 cruisers. Empires lose ships all the time, and they absorb it. They are furious because they cannot explain how they lost them." She showed me the official Korath statement released to their own citizens, which described the retreat from Meridian as a tactical withdrawal due to unexpected defensive capability. There was no mention of the silence. There was no mention of the fact that their commander had hesitated for nearly an hour, uncertain, staring at a colony that refused to give him anything to read. "They cannot admit the truth," Claire said, "because the truth makes them look like they were beaten by an enemy who never even raised their voice." I asked her what the truth actually was, from a purely tactical standpoint, because I still only understood the broad outline of what had happened at Meridian, having watched it unfold from a command deck far above the actual defense. She pulled up a reconstructed timeline, built from sensor logs and Owen's after-action report, and walked me through it carefully. "Meridian's defense teams used a pre-arranged signal protocol," she explained. "Extremely short bursts, less than a second each, carrying only coordinates and simple status codes. No open discussion. No verbal confirmation. Every person on that defense team had rehearsed this exact scenario so many times that when it actually happened, nobody needed to ask questions. They already knew what everyone else was doing, because they had planned it together long before the Korath ever arrived." "And the Korath sensors could not pick that up?" I asked. "They could pick up fragments," Claire said, "but fragments without context are just noise. A 1-second burst on an unfamiliar frequency does not tell you anything useful unless you already know what it means. Their intelligence teams likely heard those signals and dismissed them as background interference, because nothing in their experience taught them to expect a defense conducted almost entirely in silence." While the shields were repositioned and the shelters filled, Owen's forces had also quietly maneuvered a small defense squadron that had been kept in reserve, hidden behind the colony's modest shipyard structures, invisible to the Korath sensors sweeping the surface for signs of panic or retreat. When the Korath cruisers finally advanced, expecting to meet either surrender or a desperate scattered defense, they instead met a coordinated response that had been planned to the second, executed without a single wasted word, striking their weapons systems before the cruisers ever had the chance to properly return fire. "It was not luck," Claire said. "It was rehearsal. Owen's people had run that exact drill more than 100 times over 2 years, always in silence, always assuming that someday they might need to execute it for real without any warning. I sat with that for a long moment, thinking back to Nathan's classroom, to the exercise where my own group finished 11 minutes faster than the loud version simply because we were not spending effort managing each other's fear. Meridian had been the same principle, scaled up to something far more serious, and it had worked exactly the way it was designed to work. What surprised me most, over the following weeks, was not the Korath reaction. It was everyone else's. The Vex, who traded heavily along routes near the Korath border, began quietly adjusting their own defense contracts, adding clauses that specifically referenced what they called, in their own translated records, an unknown human defensive doctrine. Ezreal, the same delegate who had laughed at our silence back on Station Halveth, sent a private message to our delegation requesting clarification on what exactly had happened at Meridian. Grace declined to give him specifics, which I later realized was itself a message, perhaps the loudest one we ever sent without saying a word. The Sonari, always quick to measure strength through open displays, began referencing the Meridian incident in their own internal military briefings, according to intercepted reports Claire showed me. Their analysts, it seemed, were struggling with the same basic problem the Korath commander had faced in the moment. How do you plan against an opponent who gives you nothing to plan against? Illyra Voss, the scholar who had once studied our silence with polite academic curiosity, sent a message directly to me, the first time she had reached out since our conversation aboard the transport ship months earlier. I read the reports from Meridian, she wrote. I do not think my colleagues understand what they are looking at. They believe this was a defensive strategy that succeeded through good fortune. I believe it was something else. I believe your species has built an entire culture around the idea that silence, properly trained and properly trusted, is more dangerous than any weapon, because it denies your opponent the one thing every strategist relies on most, which is information about your state of mind. I wrote back to her, carefully, the way Grace had taught me to write anything that might be read by eyes outside our own people. I told her she was closer to the truth than most, and that the silence was never meant to frighten anyone. It was simply what worked, the accumulated result of centuries spent learning that panic costs more than it ever saves. She did not respond to that message, and I never learned whether she agreed or whether my answer had simply given her more to quietly turn over in her own mind. But I noticed, in the months that followed, that Sonari diplomatic behavior toward our delegation shifted in small, careful ways. Less mockery, more careful watching. The kind of attention you give something you have decided you do not fully understand, and have therefore decided to treat with caution rather than dismissal. The most striking change came from the Creel, whose leader had once roared his fleet numbers across the negotiating table like a proud declaration of strength. 3 months after Meridian, a Creel trade envoy requested a private meeting with our delegation, and when Grace asked me to sit in and take notes, I expected another round of boastful posturing. Instead, the envoy, a quieter representative than the one from the original summit, asked a single question that told me everything about how far the story of Meridian had traveled. When your people go silent, he asked, how do we know if you intend to negotiate, or if you have already decided the conversation is over? Grace answered him plainly, the same way she answered everything. You will know, she said, because if the conversation is truly over, you will not be having this meeting. You will simply notice, one day, that we have stopped talking, and by then, whatever needed to happen will already be underway. The envoy did not ask a follow-up question. He simply nodded, the gesture his species used to indicate understanding rather than agreement, and the meeting ended shortly afterward, far more quickly than any Kryl meeting I had attended before. I began to notice, over the following year, that the phrase itself started appearing in translated intelligence reports across multiple empires, phrased slightly differently depending on the language, but always carrying the same meaning at its core. The humans went quiet. It became shorthand, a warning passed between traders and analysts and cautious border commanders, a signal that something serious was likely underway, whether or not anyone outside our own people could see exactly what that something was. I remember sitting with Claire one evening, reviewing yet another intercepted report, this one from a minor trading consortium that had nothing to do with either Meridian or the original summit, and finding the same phrase buried in a routine risk assessment about operating near human-controlled space. "They are teaching this to their own people now," Claire said, sounding almost amused, not as an insult anymore, as a warning. "When did that change happen?" I asked her. She thought about it for a moment before answering. "I do not think there was a single moment," she said. "I think it happened the same way our silence itself works. Quietly, without anyone announcing it, until one day everyone simply understood something they had not understood before." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over the way I had turned over Nathan's lessons and my grandmother's quiet days, and the stillness Grace had carried into that first chamber where the Creel leader had laughed at us for saying so little. I thought about how strange it was that a habit built from centuries of learning to manage our own fear quietly, without ever intending to frighten anyone else, had slowly become the single most unsettling thing about us, to a galaxy that had never learned to do the same. We had never meant for it to become a weapon. That was the part that stayed with me the longest, sitting in that small office below the command deck, watching reports scroll past that described our own culture back to us, in cautious, careful language written by people trying to understand something they had decided, collectively and without ever announcing it to us directly, to fear. But a weapon, I was slowly beginning to understand, does not need to be intended as one in order to function as one. Sometimes it only needs to be misunderstood by the people standing across from it, and left alone long enough for that misunderstanding to grow into something the misunderstanding itself could never quite put into words. 5 years after Meridian, I found myself back on Station Halveth, sitting in almost the exact same seat I had occupied during that first summit, though the chamber itself had changed considerably. The long curved table was the same, worn smooth by generations of delegates leaning on it during long negotiations, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted in ways I could feel the moment I walked through the door. Grace was still our lead ambassador, though her hair had gone mostly silver by then, and she moved a little slower than she used to. I had been promoted twice since that first summit, no longer just an aide reading the room for her, but a senior communications officer in my own right, sitting close enough to speak when needed, though I still mostly listened, because listening was where the real work happened. The Creel delegation arrived first, as they always did, though their opening address had changed considerably from the proud, booming declarations I remembered from years earlier. Their new leader, a younger representative than the one who had once mocked our silence, spoke carefully, measuring his words, glancing occasionally toward our side of the table in a way his predecessor never had. The Sonari representative, when her turn came, did something I had never seen a Sonari delegate do before. She kept her opening statement short, not silent, not in the way we practiced it, but noticeably shorter than the boastful speeches I remembered from that first summit, as though she had learned, somewhere along the way, that saying less sometimes carried more weight than saying everything you possibly could. When it came time for our own delegation to speak, Grace stood, the same way she always did, and gave a short, plain statement, no different in substance from the one she had given 5 years earlier. "Humanity thanks the Assembly for this opportunity to speak," she said, and sat back down. The room did not laugh this time. I watched carefully, the way I always did, reading the small shifts in posture and attention that told me more than any translated speech ever could. Nobody in that chamber mocked our silence anymore. If anything, several delegates seemed to lean slightly forward when Grace finished speaking, as though waiting for something more, something they clearly still expected might come, even though it never did. During the recess that followed, Ezreal approached our table again, the same Vex delegate who had once laughed his clicking laugh at my explanation of why we spoke so little. He looked older too, his many eyes a touch duller than I remembered, though his curiosity had not faded at all. "Your ambassador still says very little," he said to me, settling into the seat across from mine. "She says what needs saying," I answered, the same words I had given him years before. He studied me for a moment, and I could see him choosing his next words carefully, in a way he had not bothered to do during our first conversation. "We have learned to watch for it now," he said. "The silence. Our analysts track how much your delegations speak in any given negotiation, compared to how much they spoke in previous sessions. When the number drops sharply, our leadership treats it as a warning." "A warning of what?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "That you have already decided something," he said, "and that whatever conversation remains is simply a courtesy, not a negotiation. We have learned this the way one learns to recognize weather before a storm. The sky does not need to announce itself loudly, it only needs to go still." I thought about Grace's answer to the Creel envoy years earlier, and I realized Ezreal had arrived, in his own careful way, at almost the exact same understanding. Our silence had become a kind of instrument across the galaxy, not because we had ever intended to wield it that way, but because everyone else had spent 5 years learning to read it, cautiously, the way you learn to read any signal that has proven, again and again, to mean something serious. "Does that unsettle you?" I asked him. Ezreal considered the question longer than I expected. "It unsettled me at first," he admitted. "Now I think it has simply taught us to be more careful with each other. All of us. Not only with your people. We have learned that noise is not the same as strength, and silence is not the same as weakness. And perhaps that lesson was worth learning, however strange the way we learned it." I did not have an answer for that right away, and I was grateful when the recess ended and called us both back to our seats, because I was not entirely sure what to say to a species admitting that watching us had changed how they treated each other. The rest of that summit passed more smoothly than any I had attended before. Disputes that once would have dragged through hours of boastful posturing were settled more quickly, as though every delegation in that room had learned, whether they wanted to admit it or not, that the loudest voice was no longer automatically assumed to be the strongest one. I noticed the Denari representative pause before making a claim she might once have stated boldly, choosing instead to present it plainly and let the evidence speak for itself. I noticed the Sonari representative, during a tense exchange over border rights, go quiet for a moment before answering, and I wondered whether she even realized she was borrowing a habit that had never belonged to her people before. That evening, after the summit had concluded, Grace and I walked together toward the docking bay where our shuttle waited, the corridors of Station Halveth mostly empty at that late hour. "You did the same thing today that you did 5 years ago," I said to her, almost word for word. "I know," she said. "It still works." "Does it ever get easier?" I asked her, carrying all of that quietly, letting everyone in that room wonder what you are not saying. She thought about the question for a while before answering, the same careful pause I had watched her take 1,000 times in negotiating rooms across a dozen different empires. "It was never about making it easy," she said finally. "It was about making it honest. We do not perform our fear for an audience, and we do not perform our confidence either. We simply do the work quietly, and let the results speak once there is something worth saying." I thought about Nathan's classroom, about the exercise that finished 11 minutes faster simply because nobody wasted effort comforting each other through a solvable problem. I thought about my grandmother's quiet days, and about Owen Pierce's level voice reporting meridians secure after hours of silence that had unsettled an entire hostile fleet. I thought about Illyra Voss's careful notes, and Claire Whitfield's intercepted reports, and Ezreal's admission that watching us had quietly changed how an entire species treated its neighbors. None of it had ever been designed as a message to the rest of the galaxy. It had simply been who we were, built slowly over centuries of learning that panic costs more than it saves, and that a calm voice in a crisis keeps the people around you steady. We had never set out to become the quiet ones that other empires watched nervously, the way you watch a still sky before a storm. We had only ever tried to solve our own problems without adding noise to a universe that already had plenty of it. But somewhere along the way, in rooms full of shouting delegates and boastful fleet counts, our simple habit of speaking only when something needed saying had become the single most unpredictable thing about us to everyone else. A species you can read, you can plan against. A species that gives you nothing, that meets your loudest threats with nothing but stillness, and then, later, with results you never saw coming, is a species you learn to watch very carefully indeed. I do not know if the galaxy will ever fully understand what our silence actually means, the same way Nathan understood it, teaching a room full of nervous new attachés why we had learned, generation after generation, to lower our voices exactly when the stakes were at their highest. I do not know if scholars like Illyra will ever finish the research she started all those years ago, or whether her colleagues will ever stop treating our quiet as a mystery to be solved rather than simply a discipline to be respected. What I do know, standing in that empty corridor beside Grace, watching the lights of a dozen Empire's ships glimmering faintly through the viewport ahead of us, is that we never meant to be feared, we only ever meant to be steady, to carry our own weight without asking the room to carry it with us, and to speak plainly when there was finally something worth saying. If that steadiness looks, from the outside, like something worth being cautious of, then perhaps that says more about a galaxy raised on noise than it does about a species that simply learned, a very long time ago, that the quietest room is often the one doing the most important work. Grace stepped onto the shuttle ahead of me, and I paused for one last moment in the corridor, looking back toward the chamber where, 5 years earlier, an alien delegate had laughed at a species he assumed had nothing worth saying. I thought about how far that laughter had traveled since then, twisting slowly into caution, then into careful respect, then finally into the quiet, watchful understanding I had felt in that room today. We had never raised our voices to earn that understanding. We had simply stayed exactly who we were, patient and plain and unwilling to perform a fear we had already learned, centuries ago, to carry quietly on our own. And somewhere out among the stars, across a dozen empires who had once mistaken our silence for weakness, I imagine that lesson is still spreading, slowly and without any fanfare at all, the same way every important thing about us always has.